Hi everyone, welcome to the AOD Sector Leaders and Managers webinar. I'm Robert Sterling, CEO here at the Network of Alcohol Other Drug Agencies, or NADA. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today. For me, it's the beautiful and also sunny today, Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people joining us here today or listening to the recording. A capable alcohol and other drug workforce is one that has strong representation of Aboriginal people. I'd also like to acknowledge the workers impacted by floods here across New South Wales. We know that many of our services have been continued to be provided, but the homes of some of our workers have been impacted, and our thoughts are with you. I'd also like to acknowledge my talented colleagues at the Victorian Alcohol and Other Drugs Association, VAADA, ably led by Mr. Sam Biondo. This is a partnership between NADA and VAADA. We jointly commissioned Dr Ramon Wenzel from Curtin University to undertake this study to better understand how we can attract, recruit and retain a suitably qualified and supported workforce across New South Wales and Victoria. And a shout out to Jane from VAADA joining us today, and also Sian from NADA who worked with Ramon on this study. So 2 weeks ago, my counterpart Sam hosted a webinar on the results of the first part of this study. The focus was on workforce engagement, learning and wellbeing. Today's presentation focuses on sector leaders and managers, identity, skills and development. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the managers and leaders across the sector who've been supporting workers in what has been and continues to be one of the hardest times to deliver quality health services. We know issues around workforce recruitment and retention, the impact that issues around workforce recruitment and retention can have on managers and leaders, as well as the impact of funding uncertainty and not being able to respond to demand for treatment. And we certainly hope that what we learn from this study will enable NADA and VAADA to support current managers and leaders and foster those new and emerging sector leaders. Before I introduce Ramon, just some quick housekeeping. All participants joining today's webinar are in listen and view mode only. After the presentation, there'll be a question and answer session, and you can submit a question at any time during the webinar. To do so, please type your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may need to move your cursor or tap your touchscreen device to see it. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing online in the coming days. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ramon Wenzel. At the time of the study, Ramon was a senior lecturer at the School of Management at Curtin Uni. He's been the chief investigator of the Australian Not-for-Profit Workforce Study and director of the Learning for Purpose initiative that leverages science on work, organisations and people to help build the capacity of for-purpose sector. So over to you, Ramon, to lead us through the results.
Thank you so much for having me and for the second opportunity. So welcome from Perth, and I also just want to acknowledge and appreciate the work that's been done and the vision that NADA and VAADA had at the time of kicking this off, which goes back to the people named. In particular, I want to thank Jane and Sian and sort of tagging along and keeping me on track and working out the logistics in the background, things that often get overlooked. And I also want to acknowledge the support Rob and Sam and others who believe that this is important work that needs to be done in order to inform how you as a sector, how you as peak bodies, and how maybe each individual in fact can go about certain important topics as they relate to making a difference through the work and through the workforce. And that's what I would love to kick off with. So my screen should be coming up for you about now. That's right. And so today is all about AOD sector leaders and managers, and it's on identity, skills and development. And in fact, it's about one more piece which justifies why we need to talk about those aspects. But first things first, as was mentioned, this is a second seminar or webinar on those larger topics, and there are two reports basically. One we discussed and presented on last week, and I believe the report is already available as a PDF online or will be made available very shortly. That's the first one. It's the one you see on the left side. That's the one that's on AOD sector workforce, on engagement, learning and well-being. That focused on basically any worker, really, from the front line to the very top, if you will, and including volunteers and all sorts of roles. And then we had another look, another lens that we carved out when we designed this piece of work. That's deliberately on sector leaders and managers. And what I want to highlight is that there are these reports both each time for New South Wales in Victoria. They are highly similar, though just to be a bit more contextual, at times we reflect data that sometimes reflects both to make a stronger case. They have better sort of statistical power if we need to examine something, but at the same time emblematic quotes or certain distinctions are highlighted either for New South Wales or Victoria, and they are found in these respective reports. You certainly don't need to read both reports, like you don't need to read the one for New South Wales and Victoria unless you really want to. I do encourage you, though, to take the time and digest the one that's about the workforce on engagement, learning and well-being, and the one we're discussing today, which is all about leaders and managers. And so what this is all about, it's about understanding how we become and be a leader in this field. And so it's not so much about the right approach or a certain style of leadership, although we can discuss that or can touch on this a little in the Q&A if you're interested, and I'm happy to share my view. It's more about understanding and being useful here. What are the right things to address and how to address them right? And so that goes back to a lot of work that's been done in the larger vicinity of, looking at leaders and managers through various lenses, scholarly lenses, applied research lenses, very pragmatic lenses, and pairing that obviously with the AOD context and see what's out there or what should we know or what's maybe missing. And so to become a bit more systematic on that topic, I think it's useful to say why we did this research. It's useful to say that if we care about clients and families and communities at the end, right, that these are the targets that shall benefit from the type of work that's being provided. It's the employees that bring about their experience and their change and the quality of service and then any service to begin with. And so these workers have a work experience, which is a function of the organizational environment and many other sort of dimensions, many of which we discussed last week. And I just briefly will allude to this again in a minute. But then there are those that are leaders or managers, and that may be by formal and or informal sort of formal appointment or otherwise, basically, you could say. And how they carry out their roles, that has a substantial influence on how employees and volunteers as well experience their work. And that basically drives things like employee satisfaction, their professional growth, their performance. And so that has a downstream effect on those clients and families and communities by means of how well they can carry out their work, how motivated they are, and whether they stay on or whether that, useful knowledge and important tacit knowledge and so walks out of the door about every 16 months if you have a high attrition rate and so on. So that's why it's really important to look at leaders and managers in their own right, in a way. And becoming a leader or being a leader who successfully manages and leads other people and organization is not a trivial endeavor. And, I'm not telling you anything new here. It's not trivial. Yeah, hey, so what? But if you go, that's sort of my analogy. If we go to an airport, and I haven't been to an airport for a while, not sure about you, but you have a lot of sort of these bookstores that are squeezed into some corner, and you find a lot of those airport bookshelf books, which are made for quick read, really intuitive and appealing title. 3 things you need to do just to make your life a better experience, to be happier, to get rich, or to be a great leader. Today is not one of those books, which is not to say there aren't a few things we'd be able to name, but it's about often the mundane stuff to do right. It's about stuff you may have heard about before. But at the same time, it's also not a silver bullet. It's a lot of different things. And I'd like you to just acknowledge that being a leader is obviously not trivial, and addressing all those topics is not trivial, but there are things we can do. And so we tried to deliberately look into those places that may not be on your LinkedIn opening page, or on your LinkedIn feed of how to be a great leader, or that you may not find in an airport bookshelf too much. There's probably a bit of this, but that was the idea when we started out with this, in order to be useful with this piece of research. So what did we do, or how did we do this? There are mainly 3 sort of things 3 discrete activities we engaged in to generate data and go from there. The first is we completed a review of scholarly and grey literature as it concerns leaders and managers and their emergence and development and work experiences in the AOD context. So we just wanted to know what's actually written or known about this. And a few things are out there, obviously, but quite frankly, not so much, and in certain topics, nothing really. Which is not to say we don't know anything about leaders and managers and their emergence. That does exist, but not necessarily specific to the AOD context. Now you may wonder, well, is that necessary? Are we that special, idiosyncratic? I can't really answer that, but my hunch is that, or we know from other domains, in fact, from other industries, that there are these universal or generic things that characterize a leader and a manager and what they need and so on and so forth. And then these bespoke or idiosyncratic elements that need to be really taken into consideration. I actually believe we sort of identified a few worthwhile items for consideration here. And we wanted to see what's out there on the AOD context, and we went looking in a lot of different places. We basically looked into literature from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, US, Canada, and a couple of other international jurisdictions. My background is German, so I looked into German literature as well, just sort of to extend the range here, really. And we did a really systematic search, and we did find a fair bit of publications that discuss leaders in health, or substance abuse, or housing in a way. So these tangential, peripheral topics, but not specifically on how AOD may be defined at lived and experience. But so we looked into those pieces of work, and they informed actually what we went out to do, but also then how we narrate the report in a way. It's not so much that we want to share with you what's already known, and other work, including work done by NCTA and others, has looked at certain aspects in the past. So that's number one. Number two, we completed we completed 41 semi-structured interviews with you. Maybe you're here, that would be great. And then let me really extend my appreciation for your time, contribution, openness again. Because I did a few interviews, and colleagues of mine did a few interviews, and these were great interviews, very diverse. And these were typically about 1 hour long by phone, with a 21 leaders or managers from the Victorian AOD space and 20 from New South Wales. And what we went through is basically perceptions and experiences and views on their journey, and challenges and opportunities and interpretations of that. We transcribed those, and then we deconstructed them and interpreted them, and they helped us understand a few things I'll be talking about. And then this report here today also draws on the large online survey which we did, and which we sort of reported on mainly in the last webinar and with the last report, but we draw on that data as well in order to make a case for why we should actually pay attention to leaders and managers in the sense of the workforce, and not just sort of leading people, being a heroic leader, but being really deliberate about good implementation of HR policies and organizational protocols through the leaders. And I'll be talking about that first. So this is a chart that I again showed last time. That's a good recap and a good sort of interface to the topic where I'm heading. What you see here is a heuristic about how the organizational world operates through the lens of an individual employee, basically. So with the end in mind, performance, how good you can carry out, how well you can carry out your skills and apply the knowledge to serve the client and the family and the community. That's a function of how motivated and engaged you are. And related to that is decisions about retention or voluntary exit of the organization, whether you like it here or not, and you decide to stay on or leave. And we deconstructed some of those drivers last time, and working backwards, that sort of motivation that then leads to performance is a function of the design of work itself, how well you feel, and well-being related environmental conditions, the opportunity for professional growth and learning, and the experiences of leadership and your involvement in leadership, be it by appointment or through informal sort of roles you may carry. And people systems, which is basically HR, but it goes a bit further than that. So in terms of how certain policies and protocols enable or inhibit these important dimensions to emerge or drive or be ignored and so on. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you're new to this here, this is basically what we went through last time, and you can see that, for instance, on engagement as an outcome, work engagement as an outcome, which is what we reverse engineered, if you will. We predicted, or we were able to look at the data and establish that the design of work itself, for instance, how relational it is, how much social interaction you have, how much agency you have over your work, and how much mastery experiences the work itself provides you with. All that matters a great deal, how motivated you are, or including experiences of psychological distress / burnout that then acts in undesirable ways towards that motivation. And so we did a lot of this, and the other report speaks to this. Now, why does it matter for leaders, or when we discuss leaders or managers? Well, there are managers who lead and leaders who manage. So let me explain that a bit. You may call it strategic human resource management, or people operations, or shared leadership, or empowering your workforce. There are many names, and that saying goes, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So it's not so much about what something is called, but rather what something is. And so what we're really looking at are practices and and policies and the behaviors that enable and empower and engage the workers to do something useful. And that happens through many different pathways and many different individuals, and not just the line manager or not just HR, but in a larger way, all these different functions or individuals or entities within an organization. And whether you call it leadership and management, we could spend an entire webinar on what this is and so on, but they all have that common goal that's concerned with the overall success of the business, of serving the families and communities and clients really well. And in fact, the modern organization really differentiates. It's not really a common practice to say you're a manager and you're a leader. There are elements of both in there, and if anything, leadership tasks also tend to involve processes of social influence, of inspiring and informing and influencing others to achieve a shared goal. And management tasks involve more the application of very specific knowledge and skills and abilities and are more geared maybe towards some technical specifics. But again, the modern organization really differentiates, and it's all about making stuff happen. So there is a framework I want to take you through to convince you that that is so, that is not so much about leaders or managers, but it is about involving those who lead into everything that happens in an organization. So we have a good base to basically make case for things that need to happen with those people. And there's a very theoretically sound framework, which is called the three-dimensional people strategy. And it poses that for an organization to perform really at its optimum, there need to be three distinct dimensions of leadership and management, and they must be addressed and they must align. And so I want to take you through those. The first is called vertical alignment. And this is, by the way, your little 101 in strategic HR and management. But it is not a scholarly lens and navel gazing of how a world theoretically should look like. This is very pragmatic. So bear with me, and hopefully that resonates with you. The vertical strategy is one where you have a business strategy to begin with, right? Which is not reflected here, but a business, an organization should have a strategy. And by that, I mean, they either prioritize whether they want to have, let's say, they prioritize client retention or client growth, which is different, or profitability, or certain types of impact. Not all of those can be equally prioritized. You inherently or organically do that already, or you do it very deliberately, and you should. And you do this typically to achieve those goals by a strategy that's called low cost, like we're operating at marginal cost, or you differentiate yourself by being very special, and then you can demand higher prices for your products and services, or you're a service leader who prioritizes mainly the way people experience you, although this other bits may be rather average. These are all these sort of different strategies an organization can have. And that, by the way, does apply to non-commercial operations as well. It's not just in the corporate world, and AOD isn't like that. If you actually break it down, that applies to any given organization. And these things are maybe sometimes done, again, more in an overt, salient, and deliberate way. And very often they just happen to emerge in a certain way, and then things shift, and then you don't really have a strategy, but you're erratic as an organization, and that shouldn't happen. But let's assume you get your priorities straight, and you say that's the way we're going to go for the next year or three. Then HR would basically be asked to support that. And HR, I don't just mean that one HR person that does a payroll. I mean that as an idea of how do we manage our people. And so it would mean then if you are in a low-cost strategy, that you recruit and retain in a certain way. And that's different than if you were a service leader, because you would recruit and retain your people differently. You would recruit low-cost, probably the people who are literally the cheapest to make the case here. And for a service leader strategy, you would recruit people who are really excellent, and you would pay for them, and you would design your whole business model around that. And you would design jobs in a certain way. So you would, for For a service leader sort of strategy, you would design jobs that give people a lot of autonomy and responsibility, and that has a lot of risk in a way, but also a lot of upside and beauty for the customer. And if you're more on a low-cost strategy, you would design jobs to be really cookie-cutter mentality, to be basically very exploitative, and so on and so forth. So working that backwards means your HR strategy supports your business strategy. And that's the link that you need to establish first. And we can capture this. There's a series of questions. There's always a battery of measures we can apply, and that's what we did in the quantitative survey. And one of those is, for instance, my organization has a clearly human resource strategy that supports organizational goals. And there are others that are a bit more specific, so it isn't just this single item. Then there's another dimension, which is called horizontal alignment, which is about having a coherent and consistent approach at all the different levels of the people strategy or HR level. So that means how you recruit, how you remunerate, how you retain, how you train, and that there are these protocols and policies in place, that there's a person responsible for this, that people who would work there say, yes, we address these things deliberately, and it's not just me being left onto my own sort of devices or being just hopeful that things happen, or I know they don't. And so an item that we ask here, amongst others, to reflect that is useful policies exist for each human resource area. For instance, how we recruit, develop, promote staff, right? A promotion policy. Learning or development strategy policy that lines out you get so and so many days off, or so and so many funds are available, or there's so and so many credits you should achieve in a given year for your learning events, and so on and so forth, just to be a bit more illustrative. And so an organization must state these meaningful rules that govern those operations in certain ways, and they then reflect and support the overall strategy. And that shall not be disconnected, but rather integrated with everything else. And so then there's the third dimension. That's the action dimension. That's where leaders and managers come in. If you're wondering, why are we going here? Namely, leaders and managers, and these might be executives or line managers or team leads, they are the ones that must consistently and continuously translate the organizational strategy and the HR strategy or people strategy into really definitive actions. Otherwise, all else is rhetoric. And you know probably what I'm referring to. I would argue we probably all have worked at places where someone, typically from the top somewhere, maybe board or executive, comes up with really grand idea, really fantastic, inspirational goals, but nothing really changes. And everyone goes back to working as normal. Or someone claims there's a big change management happening and we're all painting the walls green, but the actual behavior doesn't reflect basically what we are trying to achieve. And so then people become cynical. And that's the opposite of good implementation or good action. And typically people behave in line with incentives or the incentive system. That may be pay, it may be promotion, it may be punishment, it may be recognition. And so an item that we ask amongst others is, line managers in my organizations are assessed against targets to the implementation of people strategy and policies. And there are others again that are a bit more specific, but this one is one that sort of reflects the overall idea. So that action dimension is about the enduring enactment of these well-designed strategies and policies, and then the idea is that will lead to favorable outcomes for people, organization, and clients. And so if you put this together, you can see that you have then this cube where you have these three dimensions that I've just explained to you, and all of them must exist, or if one or some is missing on that, then you can say it's more about process, or it's more about rhetoric, or it's not really driven by strategy or tactics. Ideally, you want to be, as an organization, you want to be in that upper quadrant where you got strong vertical alignment, strong horizontal alignment, and strong action. And that's what we measured, and what we found for the sector looks a bit like this. So let me explain what you're looking at. We asked basically all the respondents, the 600 or so respondents, on a range of questions, and we can see that there is variability, obviously. Not each organization operates or people experience each organization the same way. And we were able to determine clusters, so basically where some organizations are more like others and some organizations are more like some others, and then we have clusters or groups of organizations that are more similar, and they are characterized or represented here in yellow and blue and red. And so red is the more deficient people strategy, blue is a more ordinary people strategy, and yellow is a more strong people strategy as it's implemented. And there's about 45% that rank rather high. 45% of organizations that we were able to tap into rank in the upper quadrant, if you will. Then there's about a third, or 26%, that's more ordinary, and then there's about a third, or 29%, with a deficient people strategy. It's not, by the way, to say they're all bad. It's just to say they don't really got it right yet. And there's no difference between Victoria and New South Wales from what we could assess. And so why do these things matter in terms of if we apply a linear regression to these dimensions? I zoom in here, but we looked at organizational performance as an outcome, work engagement as an outcome, and satisfaction, amongst other things. And if we look here into work engagement as an outcome a little bit more closely, we can see that people are more engaged if there's vertical integration, if there's horizontal integration, and if there's action. So they are all important parts of what creates a good organization, and that your people work in the way they are best utilized for the benefit of the clients and community. And so what does it mean then? It means that for an AOD organization to operate well, you need to explicate a people management strategy that supports a business strategy, implements useful policies across all people-related operations, and realizes the cultures where leaders and managers embrace all of the above, where they do certain things maybe at times that are unpopular because they're the right things to model, the right things to do, and where they do, whether desired or maybe unpopular things, but they do them on a daily basis in order to model those behaviors, how we go about things here. So I hope that I stop here for a minute just to digest that. The purpose of going through this exercise with you is really so you hopefully believe where we're going next is important. Namely, that leaders and managers are important, and not just because they are leaders, but because they actually live what happens around a place. And they're not just there to tell other people what to do. They're not just the sort of heroic leader who has been around for the longest, or who knows the most, or who is the most charismatic. There are all these parts you see and you read about or you experience, and not all of those are wrong. But I think the main point that's often missed is that a lot of leaders and managers are actually highly responsible for making an organization work in the way that things are aligned and add up to more than the sum of their parts, and that's often being missed. So if you need to ask for funding, or if you need to make the case that this topic should be given attention, then this is what I would encourage you to refer to. And I want to shift gears a bit and look into what other things we understood about the leaders themselves, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges. So from those interviews and from the literature, although no literature specific to the AOD context here, but we identified that leader identity is an important and often overlooked aspect of supporting and developing leaders. What's leader identity? Well, it basically means for an AOD worker to become an effective leader, he or she needs to psychologically identify as a leader. So that might sound very straightforward. So it's a truism, right? To be a leader, you got to feel as a leader. Yeah, but that is not always a natural thing to happen. We ask people to become a leader or be a leader without them feeling as such, and we don't really understand what that process should look like. So people identify themselves as a leader. And now a leader is, something that you should come up with a working definition. And the sort of most basic one that we can just use for the argument in the next several minutes is, here is someone who needs to establish and empower and enable other people to achieve shared goals. That's sort of a leader. And again, that may be by formal appointment, or it may be by people just assuming these roles, or they were just sort of given a certain responsibility. And the desire to become a leader is strong in some people and not so strong in others. Yet, some people who have a strong desire are rarely appointed a leader for some reason, maybe. And those people who don't have that strong desire to become a leader, they are often finding themselves in these sort of leader roles for other reasons. So we need to really work out how do we especially address the latter, to assume a leader identity, and especially if that shift doesn't come naturally. And so for people to adopt and apply effective leader behaviors, is essentially they got to think of themselves as a leader. So from some of those interviews, you can just bear with me. I'll read them out or alongside with you. Just 2 excerpts here. I don't know, it's just probably because I've been around for so long, I guess, and I've made myself because I've got a passion for it. I'm always putting my hand up to do stuff. So there's some level of proactivity in there. I always put up my hand to do it, but it's not a reflection really about a process where someone was identified perhaps as a leader, but just they stuck around for so long, so they pick up the pieces, or they only want to sort of understand what happens around here. And a different one is, I think of myself as a leader because I think I have the responsibility, both in my role and in my position, but also who I am with my experience in whatever, to provide direction, support, and encouragement. So here's someone who really identifies as a leader. And here is someone who got to that point somehow at some point. Now, as an organization, as a peak body, you want to be able to understand those processes a bit and to accelerate them if need be, and to address them more targetedly. And there is something to be said, by the way, about people who don't want to be leaders and not called that and don't want to feel that way, but you really need them to step up. I think from what we know from the literature on leader identity generally, there's good value in allowing people to remain true to themselves, not suddenly become someone very different. So they feel they are and want to, they feel who they are and they know who they want to be, but you steadily increase these leadership demands on them whilst they remain true to who they are. And that's just one little element to keep in mind. But there are a few very specific, there are some more specific things you can do to shift workers into adopting meaningful leader identities. One is to obviously design or cater in your recruiting for those people that already have those leader identities in them, or to tap into the potential, if they can imagine, to take on these roles. And to design work itself so it contains leadership opportunities now and then, so people slowly can be nudged on that leadership path. To be more specific on that, to create social opportunities that signal to individuals that they are indeed leaders. So meaning you put them into the position of taking on responsibilities, of steering a group, of working through a problem that a team or an organization has, and to report to different lines and to own that problem and to own that process and to own that responsibility. And then you feed back to them that is basically leadership. That they have not just technically managed some process, which they will, but that they also informed and inspired and influenced people to tag along and to share information and to do something that they maybe disliked, and so on and so forth. And so then you potentially get these people more and more into the mindset that is what leadership is. You also obviously need to develop more personalized goals with them together, and a plan how to get there, and a timeline that comes with that. You know, we put you into this position for 3 months, and by position I don't mean a formal appointment or secondment. It's just, you know, you want to tag on this project, you want to sort of dabble in this field, and I help you. So that's a segue for providing support and feedback along the way. Mentoring as a more dedicated mechanism of someone who's more experienced can help, which is different than coaching. Coaching can happen through someone who is very well trained in a process of asking questions. Mentoring can be just someone who has gone through this in her own time, in her own life, gone the way before you. You can also just pair that person with another peer who is in the same position. So they have a sounding board, they have a buddy, there is social support. What's important again is expanding these psychological boundaries so that people continuously assume more that identity of I am in that role. And you need to, as an organization, you need to create these opportunities for sense-making and learning experience that happen along the plan, the timeline, to achieve those goals that jointly have been established or that have been identified as useful. I want to talk about leadership capabilities. Then what do leaders need to be able to do in order to fulfill their roles? And we looked into the literature, and if you are looking into training programs or your HR systems to inform what should happen, perhaps there's some literature we reference that talks to leadership styles, cultural competencies, change management, and there's some neat frameworks that we identified from the health sector, substance abuse in North America, and some that may be useful to you. So feel free to draw on the report. Generally speaking, capabilities are about cognition and affect and behaviors. So this is what you want people to do. They have to have certain self-regulation abilities, action routines. They need to know certain knowledge, factual knowledge or procedural knowledge. And what we try to do, I'm just here we go, is tap into how do leaders in the field see that field and make sense of it, and I annotate that. So again, I read out: the ability to build networks and work in partnership with people because you can't do it alone. And the ability to manage a crisis. Drug and alcohol, I think, more than anything else, you know, you're challenged by very complex needs thoughts of suicide. Yeah, so you need to be able to manage a crisis. And the second one is, I think people skills are absolutely essential. Building relationships and rapport and being able to engage with people and have open, honest communication are the key skills. I think you also need that working knowledge and evidence-based practice and framework. So what we saw through a series of those comments is a tension or the need to harmonize and integrate very idiosyncratic AOD kind of knowledge relating to health, clinical psychology, detoxification, abuse, and at the same time, how we lead people and organizations. So the inspiring, informing, and influencing others in the workplace. And often we get people who are obviously from a more AOD substantive point of view, psychologists or other health-related education pathways, health-related pathways. And then they're put into the position of becoming a leader and need to catch up on this rather than the other way around. So we saw this a lot in their sort of history. And so what we then, I'm sorry for jumping, I just want to make one more point. What we then try to understand is, so where does stuff rank? How do things come together? So in that online survey, we asked everyone, but we stratified this to all people who had a leadership sort of mandate, to identify through text entry what the knowledge and skills and abilities are they need in their job to excel. Not knowing what their job was to begin with, they declared that, and you have perhaps responded to that question too if you participated. And what you see here is, let me quickly explain this. People, every respondent gave us 5 of those, and there were some consistent answer options, but you could also just free type. And we then coded those, and they basically have been analyzed in a network sense, like a social network, who knows who and who's more important in the middle and who's more in the periphery. And we did this with skills. And what emerges is that AOD specific skills and knowledges and abilities, they're sort of at the one of the most important, if not the most important, on aggregate. They're highly diverse. That's sort of a bucket, a cluster of knowledge, skills, and abilities, but they are highly valued. That's what AOD leaders really believe they need. So we need to acknowledge this, and we need to train for it, and we need to maintain that level of expertise throughout time. But then there are all these other parts, namely communication, emotional intelligence, relating and networking with others. We had that reflected in the quote. Leading and supervising, self-regulation and self-leadership and self-awareness and so on. So there are all these bits that basically then come into play. And we need to, again, to train for that and to make that a deliberate target of learning opportunities to bring these things about. And this list sort of gives you a ranking by way of centrality, what's more in the center if you look at all leaders and managers who responded in aggregate and what's most important to them. And finally, we did something like a gap analysis, which basically means on the horizontal axis, you have, we aggregated these responses in terms of how important people deemed that skill to have an impact. And on the vertical axis, you can see the need for development, namely how proficient they are. And so I know it's very small, so I zoom in a bit, but basically what you see is on the upper right quadrant, which is these are the most important things, and this is the highest need for development. You'll see that AOD specific skills rank the highest. And then you have others about such as communication, interpersonal communication and presentation and so on, presenting information. That ranks very highly as a very important and with a high need for development, as is self-regulation and self-leadership and so on. And so the report also has that chart, but it also puts it into more of a ranked order, exclusively AOD specific ones, because it's very hard to determine what exactly everyone needs. But it is to highlight that we do have that tension harmony that we need to get right. And so you can look at that sort of ranked list. And finally, another theme we identified is about developing capabilities. And the a number of themes did emerge. So I read out a few quotes, and then I go over the themes, and then we open up for Q&A. There appears to be a lack of quality leadership, development and training that is good fit to the sector. A long-term vision may be to develop a bespoke fit-for-purpose development initiative. Another one says, I think you need to learn how to reflect on your practices. And then another one says, having multiple mentors, people you can pick up the phone to and say, hey, I've got this issue. What do you think when this has ever happened to you, and not being afraid to be? And I use this word because I've started to use it differently. So they talk about vulnerability and leadership to me and so on. Well, these are just a couple of comments that relate to people's leaders' experiences and how they can go about developing capabilities. And the dominant themes that emerged are about growing, that it's a lifelong journey, that people need to be able to learn from errors, because we all step up, and that's okay. And if you don't make the same mistake 3 times in a row, then that's okay. So we need to be given opportunities to make errors. It's about observing others. That came up as something important, because that field AOD context is so hard to navigate and make sense of. And so it can be a mentor, but it can be also just tagging along and being sort of a satellite to someone for a while and see what's going on, especially if you're new to this. And it's about constantly receiving feedback. It's about opportunities for formal and informal learning, and that may be knowledge sharing, it may be experimenting, it may be very deliberate, it may be organic, and these things can be brought about. I'm happy to talk more about those. It's also about opportunities to apply. So once you send someone to a training or leadership development, or name it what you will, that person has to be able to basically start the next hour, the next day to apply these things. If they just come back and there's nothing really that can be done differently, that's a problem. And don't just put the onus on the individual, which to some degree we always should, but then also wonder, what is the organization doing and supporting them in eliciting that new behavior, in recognizing and incentivizing that. It's about networks of great peers, or at least peers to begin with, and some people seem to be very lonely and isolated because that's sort of what their role is like, and the organization isn't that large, and so they are very much on their own. So connect people to their peers and to more experienced people that can, again, mentor or just put things into perspective. And then it's about the lack of funds that have been mentioned, and the lack of bespoke training, and the lack of roles to step into in terms of succession planning, and the lack of will or goodwill in an organization that makes this happen, and the lack of certainty in terms of contracts that don't exist or positions that may not exist in 6 months' time, so no one invests into training or into me. And it's also the lack of access for those in remote jurisdictions. So these are, I believe, fairly specific things that the report names that can be addressed, and not all of them will be new to you, but some maybe are, or maybe a bit more clearer now. And I believe it's a good time to open this up for Q&A, please.
Thanks so much, Ramon. I see Sarah has had her hand up. I might just see if we can allow her to talk. Sarah, did you have a question for Ramon? No, I put Sarah on the spot. She did have a hand up, but maybe that's just been a bit of an error.
That's okay. Anyone?
That's all right. Well, I mean, look, I found it really interesting. I mean, I think there's some really practical advice for NADA and VAADA, but also for services themselves. For me, I had a few things that I thought about. In the first part, you talked about those three domains, looking like having a people strategy with your overall objectives. And I was just thinking about whether the data, you were able to cut the data to think about whether they were from a small, medium or large service. Because I was just thinking about how challenging it would be for those services that don't have HR managers, or, you know, some of our large services have people and culture teams, how it would be a bit more challenging to be more strategic in people management.
Yeah, I think it's a very good comment and question probably in there. So my response is that's very accurate observation, and that's a very salient challenge. And I have operated across the for-purpose sector for probably a decade now, or just a little less. And it's very typical, but it's also the same applies to sort of commercial operations that are small and medium enterprises where you don't have a HR department, or maybe you only have one person who does a payroll and the compliance. So fully acknowledged. That being said, there are examples of those who do it really well. And they don't need a HR department. You don't need to formalize everything, because it's like communication. Everything we do is communication, whether we talk or we don't talk. It's interpreted as communication. Everything as an organization you do is part of this. Everything is a reflection of how deliberate and strategic you go about these things. Now, you may not have someone strategizing about your HR plan, but that's something I believe that NADA and VAADA can help with, and maybe not even on an individual organizational basis, but just at large, what that could look like. What strategy really is, it's an overused and abused term, by the way. People have, come up with 10-year strategies every day, and we need to be strategic. But what it actually means is to prioritize something and then stick with it and make compromises and deprioritize other things. And organizations and people aren't really used to it or willing to do some of that and believe they can do everything and they should be doing everything and everything equally well. And so it starts to me there that a small organization just needs to be really clear about, are we just taking anyone here who likes to work at this place, or are we looking for very specific people? Do we have the money to pay really well? Or if we don't have the money to pay well, for instance, then what are other perks that we can offer? And it's not about perks, it's about what is the right fit to this organization. Where do we need to start? And it's maybe also nothing that we can achieve in a year, but maybe there's a 5-year plan that we need to have. And that 5-year plan looks like this. And we want to be different in 5 years than we are today. And that is how success looks like, and be able to articulate that and integrate that with these other dimensions. So that's sort of the stuff where I come from with this framework that I haven't developed. But in how I try to explain it. And that's something a small organization can achieve as well, because I have also, to just share the counterfactual, seen and worked with large organizations which have more than a dozen people in HR, but they don't get it right. They don't even think in these terms at all. They just operate and do stuff on a daily basis that they were told to do, but no one really steps back and thinks how we can put this together in a good way. So I believe if you have people who actually want to understand this, the report hopefully gives a little bit of information, inspiration. And I believe that really qualified external consultants, and I have I'm a bit hesitant to say there are many, but there are some that can do that. And I believe work by peak body organizations can help steer organizations in the right way. Hopefully that was a useful response, Ron.
It was. Thank you very much, Ramon. And we are at time now. There is a comment by an attendee around emotional intelligence, which I also found very interesting as well. A bit tricky. We probably don't have time to respond to it. But I guess what I would say in wrapping up is that Ramon has provided both NADA and VAADA two really fantastic reports for us to use to look at strategies in the short term and definitely in the long term about how we can support both the workforce generally as well as managers and leaders. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Ramon for working with both NADA and VAADA and with our members to improve workforce recruitment and retention. So in closing, today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available on both the NADA and the VAADA website. You will be emailed a short survey, which we encourage you to attend because that helps NADA and VAADA to inform what we do. And to wrap up, I would again like to thank Ramon, Jane and the team at VAADA and everyone who participated today to hear about the results. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon.